Welcome back to the daily Rambam class. We are up to chapter 5 of the laws of Tumas Sora'as.
It's not what you watch. It's the Rambam class.
There are a total of 16 chapters. And today we are in chapter 5, which is the last of the first 5 chapters that deal with signs on one's skin. Can you hear me?
Yes, Rabbi.
Good.
Yes, loud and clear.
Wonderful. So we've been learning the last few days of different forms of tsaras that appear on a person's skin. And today we'll continue that conversation. The following principles apply with regards to a person who had a wound on the flesh of his skin, and the skin peeled away because of the wound. If the wound came about because of fire, for example, he was burned by a coal, embers, iron, stone that were heated in fire, or the like, this is called a mikhveh, a burn. That's one type of wound. If the wound did not come about because of fire, for example, he received a blister from stone, wood, or the like, or the wound came about because of an infirmity within the body, a wart or eczema that ruined the skin, or swelling lesions, feverish swellings or infections that ruined the skin, it is called a shchin, a boil. So we have two types of wounds on the skin. One is imposed by fire, or three types. The second is there's two types as far as tsaras is concerned. Either it's caused by fire, or it's caused by any other cause, such as either he was knocked or he was sick. Now that we've categorized these two types of wounds, we have either a mikhveh, that's what's produced by fire, it's a burn, and we have a shchin, which is freely translated as boils. We're coming up to Pesach. One of the 10 plagues was shchin, and the Egyptians were smelt with boils. Now that we've clarified that we have mikhveh and we have shchin, we have burn skin damage, and then we have boil skin damage. So the following laws apply if one heated a spit and hit another person with it. So here, this is a hybrid because it was hot, but there was impact. So which one is it? So if its end was rounded, the wound it produces is considered as a burn, because the fact that the end of the rod was round, we assume that the damage was more from the heat than it was from the impact. If its end was pointed, then there's an unresolved question if it is considered a mikhveh or shchin, a burn or a boil. When a person suffers a burn because of the hot springs of Tveria or olive dregs or the like, this is considered as a boil. It's only when it comes from fire, not from other forms of heat. I remember as a kid, I once decided we were on Shabbaton, and they had a fluffy slide, a zip line, that went over a little pond, a little lake. And you could go from one side to the other. And you could jump into the water. But most guys just went from one side to the other. And then they would just get out on the other side. So eventually you had guys that were dressed. They weren't in their bathing suits because they knew they could just skip the river. So I decided to take it to another level. And I took a camera with me to take pictures. And then I held the rope that you usually use to pull it back in my other hand so I could adjust the speed. But the problem was, in a few seconds, I got burned terribly. I didn't expect it. But since you're going fast and I was holding the rope, so it burned my hand. So I was wondering, is that considered a burn or a boil? But if you say that the springs of Tveria are considered as a boil, not a burn, it sounds like a burn is specifically from fire. So it sounds like that would actually be, in this context, it would be considered a boil, not a burn. As long as boils and burns are fresh, festering wounds, they are called mordin and do not impart impurity because of tsaras at all. So as long as it's a fresh wound, the tsaras that appears on it is not tameh. If a boil or burn heals and the afflicted person's flesh was entirely restored, so it's no longer raw flesh, but rather the flesh was restored, even though there's a scar on the place and it is not entirely like other skin, this is considered like ordinary skin with regards to all matters. So once it's completely healed, even if there's a scar, then that's normal. Such a person is deemed tameh, impure, because of the three types of tsaras that we've discussed in the previous chapters. And he is isolated for 2 weeks as part of the process of determination, as explained. We said if there weren't yet 2 hairs or to see if it would spread, etc. Now, if the boil or the burn began to heal and be restored with a scab like the thickness of a garlic peel forming over them, this is the scarring of the boil mentioned in the Torah and the healing of the burn mentioned there, or in Hebrew, Soreves Hashchin and Michyas Hamichva. They impart impurity because of 2 signs: white hair or an increase in the size of the blemish, and such a blemish is isolated for only 1 week. So let me just summarize that again. Okay, so there's 3 stages in the healing process. The person just has that wound, let's say it was a burn, when it's a fresh burn. So at that point, he cannot get tsaras in that place. If he does, it does not make him tameh. Then we have once it's completely healed, and then even if there's a scar, it's like any other skin, and he can become tameh in one of 3 ways, either by having 2 white hairs, or by having the white spot spread, or by having some raw flesh in the middle. If it's in between, meaning that it's not a fresh wound, it's begun to heal, already has a thin layer of skin over it, but it hasn't completely healed, then we say that it can only become impure from 2 signs, not 3, either from white hairs or from spreading, but not from raw flesh in the middle, because the whole wound is somewhat raw. Secondly, there would only be 1 week of quarantine, waiting to see whether he is indeed tameh or not. What is implied? There was a baheres of the scarring of a boil or the healing of a burn. If it contained 2 white hairs, the person would be deemed definitively impure. He is tameh. There are 2 white hairs over that white spot. If it does not contain white hair, he should be isolated for 1 week and re-examined at the end of the week. If the white hair grew or the size of the blemish increased, then he is tameh, definitely. If there was no new developments, he should be released from the inspection process and is pure. If the size of the blemish increased, white hair grew after he was released from the inspection process, then he would become tameh, but he would not need to wait for that. We can assume that he's fine. At that point, he is pure until proven impure. Now, the healing boil and the healing burn cannot be combined with each other, these 2 types of wounds. For that reason, the Torah described them separately. Because until now, we've said that they're the same. We're wondering what's the difference if it was because of a fire or it was eczema. Either way, there's a wound. He says, no, the Torah mentions them separately because we know that there's a minimum measurement for tsaras. And that tsaras, if you had half on the burn and half on the boil, then that does not combine. Nor can they expand into each other. They do not expand into ordinary flesh, and the baheres that is on ordinary flesh does not expand into them. So they are judged independently. What is implied? If there is a boil next to a burn, and a baheres means a white spot, one that is of shades of white that makes the person potentially impure. And that baheres has a gris. Gris is the minimum amount that the baheres needs to be able to make the person impure. But that gris extended over these 2 wounds. So there was half a grist on the boil and half a grist on the burn. The person is pure. Why? Because we said the two forms of foods do not combine, and we look at them distinct. We look at each of them distinctly, and so each one has only half the measurement. If a Maharis was in either of them and it extended into the other, or it extended into the skin around it, he again is pure. If there was a Maharis on ordinary skin and it extended into one of these, again he is pure. It's not considered an extension. These are independent. They are independent republic zones within a larger area. When a person, or maybe not republic, but either way, when a person has a healed boil that was the size of a grist, with a Maharis the size of a grist on the palm of his hand, you might say, what's the point of him waiting? There can't be, white hairs won't grow there because we've learned that white hairs on the palm of a hand are not a sign of impurity. And it can't spread either because we said that it can't spread from a burn to outside of a burn or a boil to outside of a boil. So that means that that white spot has no way to expand. So if so, there's no reason for him to quarantine. Say, no, he should still quarantine. Why? Although it is not fit to grow white hair or to expand, there's the possibility that he will develop another boil next to this one. And once it's the same type of wound, even if it's two boils, since they're both boils, then the white spot would have the opportunity to extend into the second boil and make him impure. Now, what happens if a boil became a burn? So first he had a boil and then he got burned to that very same spot. So the burn nullifies the boil. Now we would refer to this no longer as a boil, but to a burn. When a burn becomes a boil, the reverse, originally he was burned, so now a boil develops over there, not as a result of the fire. Then the boil nullifies the burn. If it is not known whether a blemish was a boil or a burn, it doesn't matter, because either of them contract impurity due to the same signs, and the impurity is the same. The Torah just differentiates between them only to teach that they are not combined. If a person was isolated because of a Maharis, meaning a white spot in a boil, and at the end of the week, the boil healed and became ordinary flesh, or vice versa. He was isolated because of a Maharis on ordinary flesh, and at the end of the week, it became a boil. He restarts, because now it's a new type of wound, which makes it, or a new type of skin, which means it's reset mitzaras. When all the hair on a person's head falls off, whether due to sickness, due to a wound that makes him unfit to grow hair, or due to eating foods that cause hair to fall out, or applied lotions that cause hair to fall out, since he lost all of his hair at this particular moment, he is called a kareach or gibeach, even though at a later point his hair may regrow. As we've learned, or we haven't yet learned, I'm not sure, but a kireach is, and a gibeach is when the person does not have hair either on the front half of his head or the back half of his head. If his hair from the top of his forehead and downwards, descending backwards until the first vertebra of his neck falls off, he's a kireach. If his hair from the top of his forehead and downwards, descending frontward, comes off, is called the gibeach. And what's the way to remember this? Because gimel comes in front of kuf. If you line up the aleph phase, gimel comes before kuf. So the front half of the head is called the gibeach if he's bald there, and the kireach is if he's bald the back half of his head. Now, how does this impact tzaras? With regards to both of these types of baldness, a person can contract impurity when a Maharis appears on the skin through two signs: either healthy skin or an increase in size. White hair, on the other hand, is not a method by which you can become impure. And such a person would be isolated for 2 weeks, as the Torah says, like the appearance of tzaras on the flesh of the skin. Since these portions of the body do not grow hair, the appearance of white hair is not a sign of impurity. What is meant by incurring impurity through either of these two signs, and that a person may be isolated for 2 weeks? Let's spell this all out. If there was a baheres, meaning there was a white dot on his head in a bald spot, whether at the back of a person's head by his kirayach or at the front of his head, and there was healthy flesh in it. So we said one of the signs of impurity is when you have a white spot and a little bit of healthy flesh in the middle. So then he's definitely impure. Or he should be deemed definitely impure by the Kohen, he's Tameh. If it does not have healthy flesh in it, you just have a white dot, so then he needs to be isolated and examined after the end of 1 week. If healthy flesh appeared on the blemish, or the white dot increased in size, then the Kohen should deem him definitely impure, definitively impure, Tameh. If nothing changed, he should be isolated for a 2nd week. If at the end of the 2nd week, the blemish increased in size or a healthy flesh appeared, then once again, he should be deemed by the Kohen definitively impure. If nothing changed, he is dismissed. And if at a later point it increased or a healthy flesh appeared, then he would still be deemed definitely impure, definitively impure. But as we said, at this point, he is pure until proven Tameh. Now, these two forms of boldness, karachas and gibachas, are not combined with each other. Just like we said, the two types of burns and boils don't combine. The two bald spots on the front half of his head and the back half of his head also do not combine, as the Torah says, which makes a distinction stating on his karachas or on his gibachas. Why does it differentiate between karachas, the back half, and gibachas, the front half? This teaches that there are two types of conditions, and blemishes do not spread from one to the other, from either of them to ordinary flesh, or from ordinary flesh to them, just like we learned about the burns and the boils. Now, what happens if there's a burn or a boil on a karachas, on the back half of his bald head, or on a gabachas, on the front half, or on a beard that has lost his hair? So they are deemed impure in the same way as a boil or burn on ordinary flesh. So whether a boil or burn appear in a bald spot that usually grows hair or anywhere else, it's the same. It makes it, yeah. But when one loses the hair on his head or on his beard, these parts of the body are considered as ordinary flesh with regards to all matters, except that they do not contract impurity because of the emergence of white hair. So that it's not the same. I guess maybe with exception to that. Because what did we say before about the shchina, or the boil or the burn? We said that white hair does make it impure. We said fresh skin doesn't, but white hair does. Yep. But we're saying on the forehead, it's the same, except that a white hair does not make it impure. So that's the exception. When hair was never grown on one's head or one's chin, or when there is a blister on one's head or chin, the surface is considered as ordinary flesh, and they are deemed impure because of all three signs and require isolation for 2 weeks. So if he has never grown hair over there, it's like any other part of his skin, and then he could become impure by any of the 3 ways: by fresh skin in the middle, or by spreading, or by white hair. Similar laws apply to the chin of a woman and a sexually inadequate male. Until hair grows on these surfaces, they are considered as ordinary flesh. If they grew hair, they are considered as the chin of a male and do incur impurity as a netek does, as will be explained, meaning areas that usually have hair that right now don't. They do not incur impurity because of a baheres, because they are an area where skin grows, which are charged differently. And now it's time for the quiz. The term shchin refers to a fresh wound, a healing burn, or a healing boil.
Number 3.
Healing boil.
Well done. If white hair grew from a baheres on a boil, after the person was released from the inspection process, does he become pure? Impure, Tommy.
Yeah, sure.
Yes or no? Sorry.
Yeah, yes.
Good. If a person was isolated because of a baheris in a boil, and at the end of the week the boil healed, what is the law? The person is pure, and the blemish need not be looked at again. The blemish is inspected again, and it is regarded as a continuation of his earlier adulterous status of impurity. Or with regards to the blemish, we regard the blemish as a new development, not a continuation to what he had before.
Number one.
I think number 3.
Number 3.
I think that if we said that if the boil disappears, then he starts afresh.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Which of the following is not a sign of impurity for a gibeah, which is a bald front half of his head? The appearance of a white hair, healthy skin in middle of a baheris, or the baheris increasing in size, which is not a sign of impurity.
White hair.
The
Correct.
white hair, yeah.
Thank you so much for joining and wishing you a Shavua
Thank
Tov,
you.
a good